aggro is viable in Commander. Let me explain. You see this? You see this card right here? This is Anim Pakal, Thousandth Moon. And like Lil Wayne said all those years ago, and I paraphrase, she's a beast, she's a dog, she's a mother-loving problem. Okay, you're a goomba, was a goon to a goblin. No, you ain't Skyrim. So anyways, welcome all, genties and ladlemen, to another tech deck. So a little backstory on this one. A little while ago, I kept seeing a bunch of videos in my feed pop up, and they were saying like, oh, you know, this is why aggro is so difficult to do in Commander, and it's basically a non-strategy in Commander. And I was like, excuse me? I don't think so. I also had a buddy of mine in my regular play group. You know, he's just kind of describing some of the color pie to a newer player. He said generally Boros is the weakest color combination. And I took offense to that. No matter the case, Anim Pakal, she's a 3-drop, 1, a red, and a white, a legendary creature human soldier. And whenever you attack with one or more non-gnome creatures, put a +1 counter on her, and then create X 1/1 colorless Gnome artifact creature tokens that are tapped and attacking, where X is the number of +1 counters on her. I'm gonna call them Gnomes this whole video, by the way. What exactly are we trying to do in this deck? We're just beating face as quickly as possible and dealing damage for all of these tokens. So before we move on to talk about the cards in the deck, let's talk about the budget real quick. So I'm not gonna lie, I didn't spare a whole lot of expenses for this one. I already own a decent amount of the more expensive cards in this list, so I'd only be out like maybe $100-$120 to build this deck. The deck altogether, you'll probably find it for around $250 to $300, given you don't own any of the cards in the deck. You could probably run a budget version of this deck, definitely account for your own financial situation. If you're interested, use this list as a jumping off point. Change what you need or what you want to about the deck. Or at the very least, this list is here to prove a point that you can make aggro, and Boros is a very viable color combination in Commander. With all that being said, let's get into our first category here, sluggish. So one of our primary win cons is to deal a decent bit of damage to everyone on the table, just all at once. There are a lot of ways to deal damage for our creatures entering. In this first section here, we have Molten Gatekeeper, Witty Roastmaster, Impact Trimmers, and War Leader's Call. These all deal 1 damage for each creature that enters the battlefield. So if we can get a lot of gnomes entering all at once, then they're going to deal a lot of damage all at once. The War Leader's Call is also a really solid anthem effect for 3. I don't know why this card only costs 3. It should have probably costed 4 or 5. Considering you get 2 cards for the price of 1, it's pretty solid. So moving on, we have Agate Instigator and Perforos, God of the Forge. And these guys, they both give you 2 damage for each creature entering the battlefield. Now, Agate Instigator, I know you have to pay for the offspring cost, but it is on the same rate as Perforos. That's usually how I want to play this card, unless that I just don't have another turn to play, and I need to throw something out there. Now, the next 2 cards we're going to look at here are Reckless Fireweaver and Ingenious Artillerist. They deal 1 damage for each artifact that enters the battlefield, so the gnomes are artifacts. And then our last card in this sluggish damage dealing section is a relatively new one, and that is Arabella, Abandoned Doll. So whenever she attacks, she deals X damage to each opponent, and you gain X life. That is actually really important, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less. So all of these gnomes, they enter as 1/1 creatures. Now all of a sudden, every time she attacks, you're getting 1 damage and gaining 1 life for each of them. Alrighty, so moving on to our next category here is +1 counters, baby. Okay.
So this is all the ways we're going to be getting extra +1 counters on Anim Pakal, so that way we can make more gnomes every single attack. So this first card is it's a really random one-off card, and it is Myr Scrapling. It is a one-time extra +1 counter. It's really good if you play it on turn 1 or 2, because then you can swing with it the turn that you bring out Anim Pakal, and then you can sacrifice it before Anim Pakal's ability goes off to give her 2 +1 counters and make 2 gnomes on turn 3 instead of just the one you would have made had you played, I don't know, something that isn't Myr Scrapling. But it's the only card that's kind of like that in the deck. It helps us keep our curve low. That's pretty much why it's in here. It's also an artifact, so it synergizes really well with those damage dealing cards that care specifically about artifacts. Our next little section here is going to be all the things that just put extra +1 counters every single turn. Luminarch Aspirant, Lae'zel, Vlaakith's Champion, I don't know if I said that correctly, and Citadel Siege. The Luminarch and the Citadel Siege, they just give extra +1 counters every single turn. That's just a given. And then the Lae'zel, because Anim Pakal gives herself +1 counters every time you swing in. You always want to be swinging with something, and even if you're not, there are other ways to put +1 counters on her in this deck. And so the Lae'zel is effectively just giving you extra +1 counters every single turn. It essentially puts in more work than these other two here as well, because it gives an extra +1 counter every single time you place counters anywhere. That's just some solid stuff right there. Now, some other cards we have that give extra +1 counters every single turn is Orzhov Advokist and Noble Heritage. So these, they both give +1 counters every single turn, but these also have the upside of some potential benefit of having some protection from your opponents should they choose to also put +1 counters on their creatures. But the Advokist in particular, it stops your opponents from swinging at you if they choose to put +1 counters on anything. And then the Noble Heritage, it just gives you full-on protection from them for an entire turn. Now, you do have to have your commander out on field. It's definitely really solid to curve out with this one. Coming out the gate with +1 counters on her, and then getting just full protection from an opponent. Just absolutely solid line of play here. Now, the next two cards we're going to look at are, and I'm going to butcher the name here, Inti, Seneschal of the Sun, and Showdown of the Scalds. So these both are ways of putting +1/+1 counters on Anim Pakal, but they also let you see more cards off the top of your deck. Now, granted, they are impulse draws. You do have to play those cards that turn, but that's usually not an issue in this deck. A lot of times this deck is looking to just step on the gas, and when you're running out of things to play or you have like a dead draw, all of a sudden these cards can just help you mitigate those dead draws as much as possible. And then another neat thing about Inti in particular, if he gives a creature a +1 counter, he gives it trample as well. So giving Anim Pakal trample while she has like 6, 7 +1 counters on her already, I mean, that's just really solid. You're getting in for extra damage, and that is exactly what we want to be doing in this deck. Now, the next card we're going to look at here is a Guide of Souls. So you get some extra life gain on our ETBs, as well as extra counters effectively every single turn. And it gives Anim Pakal permanent flying. It gives her a flying counter. I didn't mention it before, I'll go ahead and mention it now. The life gain, it's especially relevant in this deck because when we're attacking everybody's face like we want to be doing in this deck, the only way we're losing... Okay, that's not the only way, but one of the primary ways that we can fall behind in the game is if everybody else attacks back as well. There are some games where we just aren't outpacing 3 combined players in terms of damage on board. So that life gain can really, it can really be a lifesaver. It can help us win the game. It can help us stay in the game longer to have these explosive swings and deal this massive amount of damage really quickly without being so worried about the clapback. Next, we're going to look at 2 cards that give us a ridiculous amount of +1 counters really fast with all the tokens that we're creating, and that is Rosie Cotton, and Cathar's Crusade. Now, Rosie Cotton, she just puts +1 counters on one creature, which is ideally going to be Anim Pakal herself, and then that will create us even more tokens. It just snowballs so fast. And notably, she creates a +1 counter on her ETB effect because she creates a food token when she enters the battlefield. And then Cathar's Crusade usually just ends the game outright the turn it comes down if you play it at the right moment. And you usually don't want to play it too soon if you can't win the game already, because people are going to look at you and think that's really scary, and you're just going to get targeted down immediately. So definitely be careful about when you're playing it. Know that you're going to be public enemy number 1 for the table. With that being said, that's all of our +1 counters. Let's move on to some of our other miscellaneous token synergies, just some of the cards that go really well with the tokens that we are creating. So first off, we have Soul Warden and Suture Priest, and these both just serve as some extra life gain on our ETBs. Suture Priest is also really good for chipping in on our opponent's life totals whenever they play creatures. So if you're going up against another token deck, or if you're going up against anyone who's dumping a whole bunch of creatures on board, Suture Priest is really good for punishing that. So the next card we're going to look at is Legion Loyalist. Now, Legion Loyalist, it gives all of our creatures first strike and trample as long as we're attacking with, I believe, 3 or more. Do be careful. Don't get caught in the trap. The tokens, whenever they enter the battlefield, they enter the battlefield attacking already, so they don't trigger the Legion Loyalist effect. However, if you have 3 creatures already on board, you just go ahead and swing. All of a sudden, everything gets first strike and trample. That trample's really good with Anim Pakal, and the first strike is surprisingly pretty relevant. And then another line of text on here that is also really relevant: your creatures can't be blocked by creature tokens the turn that this ability triggers. It stops your opponents from chump blocking with their tokens that they may be creating. It's just another contingency plan against other token decks. That's definitely really helpful. The next card to look at here is Ardoz, Cobbler of War. Now this makes all of our gnomes much more threatening when they enter the battlefield attacking already. It gives all of our gnomes +2/+0. They enter as 3/1s for that turn. And so this can definitely help pile on some damage, and if nothing else, it can help kill any creatures that may want to block our gnomes. And then its second ability creates a 1/1 red goblin for 4 mana. I have never used that ability, but it might help you populate the board if you get into a sticky situation. Next, we're going to look at Mondrak Glory Dominus. All it does is just help us flood the board, so it doubles all of our tokens. There's not much to be said about this one here. That's just a really good effect. Something else that's notable about it as well is that it can almost always give itself indestructible. As soon as it comes down, if you have 1 extra mana, you will most definitely have another couple of artifacts to sacrifice with these gnome tokens. The last bit of token synergy that we're going to look at here is Divine Visitation. Now this one, I don't think it needs any introduction either, but in case you haven't heard, it's a 5-drop enchantment, and whenever a token enters the battlefield, it enters as a 4/4 flying angel. Now usually if you have a couple of +1 counters on Anim Pakal, this is another one of those cards, just like Cathar's Crusade. It ends the game on the spot when it enters the battlefield. Be careful with your timing on it. You don't want to play it and then put a target on your back and not in the game. Or at the very least, take out the most problematic player, maybe the 2 most problematic players on the board, and enter in a 1v1. This deck if you can pull off a 1v1 situation, I mean, good luck to your opponent, because I doubt you're going to lose in that situation. So now that we've looked at all of our ways to put +1 counters and deal damage and create extra tokens and synergize with those tokens, let's look at some ways to get free swings with our creatures. Considering we do want to be attacking in this deck, we don't want that to come at the cost of the game for us. And we also don't want that to constantly come at the cost of losing our own creatures. So the first card I want to mention here is Basri Ket. This planeswalker, I have seen him floating around here and there, and I've always kind of wondered what kind of a deck does he go in? You know, because I doubt he really goes in much of a Voltron deck, but I don't know. I doubt he really goes in much of a token deck either. But then you get to a deck like Anim Pakal, and he does everything you want a card to do in this deck. He can give her extra counters with his +1 ability. He also gives her indestructible, so she's able to swing without a fear of dying. And then he also synergizes with some of the other cards that we've mentioned before that benefit off of tokens entering, with his -2 ability, being able to create some tokens. And then his ultimate ability, I doubt you're ever going to get to a point where you're going to need this in the game. However, if you do get there, sweet. Like, more power to you. The next two cards we'll mention here are Iros, God of Victory, and Dolmen Gate. Now, these allow all of our creatures to swing without taking any combat damage. So we negate all of the combat damage that they would take, but we don't negate any of the combat damage that they would deal themselves. These two cards definitely help us turn the tide of the game. At least in terms of combat, nobody is going to be able to compete with us with these cards on the board. And then two last cards here are Gustcloak Survivor and Reconnaissance. So these allow all of our creatures to be removed from combat. So this is great for still getting our swing triggers, and all of our swings are safe. And then you have the added benefit of Reconnaissance, giving them pseudo-vigilance. So for those of you who might not know, you give them pseudo-vigilance because you can activate it after damage has been dealt, but before the end of combat phase. It definitely has a lot of uses. So that's all of our ways to get free swings in this deck. Let's look at one of the most important slew of cards, which is our protection. So the first two cards we're going to look at here are Swiftfoot Boots and Champion's Helm. So they both give Anim Pakal hexproof. Once she gets scary enough, people are probably going to want to remove her, so you definitely want to keep her protected. And then the next card we're going to look at here is Mithril Coat. It's another one of those classic, equipment staples. It gives her indestructible, pretty cut and dry, pretty simple. And then the next two cards we're going to look at here are Mother of Runes and Skrelv Defector Mite. Now they are both amazing creatures. The fact that they're creatures is actually really solid. If we need to trigger Anim Pakal's ability on turn 3, then we just swing with them instead. If somebody's open, which usually on turn 3, there's more often than not, there's at least one player who's still open and getting a slow start in the game. But they are great sources of instant speed protection, and they give you protection from any specific color. They're also really nice because you have the option to use them defensively, or you can use them offensively. So you can use them defensively if somebody goes to play a kill spell on Anim Pakal. Well, they're going to think twice about it because you have an untapped Mother or you have an untapped Skrelv that are there to give your commander protection. They might hold on to that removal spell, or they might use it on something else, whatever the case may be. But then you can also use it offensively to basically say, well, hey, all of your creatures are, of the same color. They're all green or whatever the case may be. I'm going to give my commander protection from green, and she's going to swing in for free. You can't block her. You can't deal damage to her. You can't target her. None of that stuff. So these two cards are definitely really solid includes in this deck. Now, this next slew of cards is Selfless Spirit, Boros Charm, Grand Crescendo, Flawless Maneuver, and Your temple is under attack. I love saying that card's name like that. It's just such a silly name for a card. These are all cards that grant your entire board instant speed, indestructible, for a single turn. Selfless Spirit being a creature that can attack. I mean, anything that you can find that is a cheap creature and gives you a similar effect definitely adds to the synergy in this deck. Grand Crescendo is also really solid. It gives you more bodies on board, depending on how much mana you have, but you can also just do the simple pay 2 mana, give everything indestructible. Flawless Maneuver, it's one of those cards that everybody hates, nobody sees it coming. It is essentially a free spell as long as Anim Pakal is out, and then your temple is under attack. Is really nice because it also has the option for card draw. If you need to dig for answers for any reason and people aren't removing your stuff at the moment and somebody else is the arch enemy at the table at the time, it can definitely help you dig for answers. It can help your opponent dig for answers. Bit of a political card. You can definitely make a deal with people if you'd like. And so it's just a really solid include in here. Now let's look at a couple of cards that help us tutor out those protective equipments. So we are running Relic Seeker and Steel Shaper's Gift. Relic Seeker, it's absolutely wonderful because it is a creature and it needs to attack in order for you to get that trigger to search for your equipment. So these are just two really solid cards. They help with the consistency of the deck a little bit, kind of to help us, make sure that Anim Pakal stays protected. And so just really solid includes in here. I just threw those two in there. I don't typically like tutors very much, particularly when the tutors exist to grab a very specific thing. I generally like when my tutors can grab me a bunch of different answers. But I left these two in, and that's that. So next, let's look at our green vegetables. And I am, of course, talking about our removal and our interaction package. So we are running Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, and Parting Gust to exile some pesky creatures. So Path and Swords, they are the best white removal cards, probably the best removal cards in the game, arguably. Parting Gust is also really, really great because it can be used as a potential defensive option as well. You essentially blink something for not promising the gift, and then when it comes back, it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. Instead of needing to remove a creature, if you instead are looking down at a board wipe that your opponent is playing, boom, Parting Gust, my Anim Pakal will leave the battlefield, and then she will come back with a +1 counter, so that way I don't have to spend so much of my resources building my game plan back up. So that's definitely a really good way to use this card. Honestly, I'm surprised I haven't seen more people use it in games already. Next up, we have Chaos Warp and Stroke of Midnight. Now these two, they get rid of any troublesome permanents that may be on the board. I don't think they need much more introduction than that. They're pretty solid. I am going to move on. So next, I actually have a lot of artifact and enchantment removal, more specifically because of effects like Propaganda, where you can't attack your opponents. But there's also, if you run into any stacks pieces, this deck is definitely weak to stacks. So I wanted to have quite a few different ways to get rid of artifacts and enchantments. So we have Hopeful Initiate, we have Requisition Raid, Revoke Existence, and Rip Apart. So like I said, they all target artifacts and enchantments. Now, Hopeful Initiate, hopefully, see what I did there? Will be able to be recursive removal. You take 2+1 counters off of something and you get rid of an artifact or enchantment, and you can keep doing that as long as the Hopeful Initiate is still on the board. So Requisition Raid is really solid because it can add +1 counters to your entire board. But not only that, it can remove an enchantment and an artifact. So you get a 2-for-1 with that. Revoke Existence is a really great card against, like, particularly gods that are indestructible because it exiles them. And then Rip Apart is really solid as well because you have the capability of taking out small creatures with its mode to deal 3 damage. So it's definitely really solid. So these next couple of cards I want to look at here are Vandal Blast, Austere Command, Vanquish the Horde, and Blasphemous Act. Now they're all here because they put in some work across the entire table, and they help do some resetting if needs be. Vandal Blast, you destroy all of your opponent's artifacts. I personally haven't played Vandal Blast too many times, but the amount of games where I wish I had one, I'm starting to include this in more of my deck lists. And then Austere Command is really solid. It's the only 6-drop in this deck. Like, just straight up, the only 6-drop. It's really good because the modality of it is really solid. So if you wanted to get rid of, like, everyone's big creatures, you could. And then get rid of all enchantments. Like, that is definitely a line of play that is really solid with this card. I mean, you could do a whole lot of work on the board and still keep Anim Pakal and all of your tokens. And then Vanquish the Horde and Blasphemous Act, I mean, these are just the best cheap board wipes. We don't want to board wipe a whole lot, but it is always good to have that fallback, that little contingency, just to reset the table and say, you know what, most of my cards are fairly cheap anyways, so we are usually able to build our board state back up quicker than most of our opponents after a board wipe like this. So with all that being said, that's all of our interaction, that's all of our removal. Let's move on to the card draw. We need a good bit of card draw in this deck, particularly because, you know, we are an aggro deck, so one of our weaknesses is that we have a tendency to just play all of our aggressive stuff and then run out of things in our hand. You know, we run out of gas. We need to add some more fuel to that tank. So starting off, we have a couple of one-off draws. We have Insolent Neonate, Magus of the Wheel, and Cut a Deal. Now, these all are in the deck for some one-time card draws. Neonate is a great attacker to trigger Anim Pakal before you sacrifice it to draw a card. And then Magus of the Wheel, it's really great for refilling your hand and just kind of, you know, you're back to your starting hand size. You refill that tank. And then Cut a Deal. I'm surprised I haven't seen Cut a Deal at more tables, because this, in my opinion, it just ends up being one of the single best white draw spells. It causes all of your opponents to draw 1 card apiece, and it causes you to draw 3 cards. This is a spell in white that is 3 mana, draw 3 cards. Like, why is nobody running this? People run this card. So that's all of our one-time effects. Next we have Rumor Gatherer, Welcoming Vampire, and Takasia's Welcome. And these are all of our stick-on-board recurring card draws, particularly when our Gnome tokens enter the battlefield. They're going to trigger all of these. Rumor Gatherer, you need at least 2 creatures entering the battlefield during that turn, which is not hard to do at all. And then, after you draw for that second creature entering, each other creature after that lets you scry 1. If you're really digging for an answer, sometimes you get, like, you know, 5, 6 gnomes, and you're able to search through, you know, quite a few cards there if you're looking for something very specific. You can look at a lot of cards until you get to the one you need and then keep that one on top. There are a couple of other forms of recurring draw that aren't triggered by our ETBs. One of them being Esper Sentinel, and the other being Aurelia, the Law Above. Now, Esper Sentinel, I'm not sure that this needs any introduction. With the amount of cards that can give other things +1 counters, Esper Sentinel can actually get pretty big to the point where your opponents are never going to be able to pay for that. And then Aurelia, the Law Above, she's really solid. I guess you could consider her a bit of a pet card. I just wanted to include another really cool legendary Boros creature in here. I mean, whenever any player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card, so you're usually, especially by the time this comes on the board, you're usually attacking with more than 3 creatures. And then if your opponents are trying to clap back at you, well, now you're drawing cards for that as well. And then the same thing with 5 or more creatures, you get 3 damage to each of your opponents and you gain 3 life. So again, another small instance of life gain, but this definitely adds just a little extra oomph to the damage that you're dealing, and it can definitely put in a lot of work, not to mention Flying, Vigilance, Haste. I mean, these are all great keyword abilities. This thing is a solid attacker that also just gives you a bunch of utility. This thing puts in some work. But speaking of utility, now let's move on to the utility lands that I put in this deck. So first off, we're running Captivating Cave, Cave of Temptation, Hall of Oracles, Karn's Bastion, and Restless Bivouac. I don't know if I said that right. Bivouac. Bivouac. All of these lands, they just help us put some extra +1 counters on Anim if needed. So if we don't have any card draw, we're kind of running out of steam. Well, this can help us maybe not press the gas much harder, but definitely helps us kind of keep it idling. We are also running Diamond City for some extra protection. This thing can give you a shield counter on any creature you control. You can only do this if 2 or more creatures have entered the battlefield this turn. So in this deck, that's super easy to accomplish. I mean, you're basically doing that just playing Anim and swinging 1 time. Next, we also have War Room, and this just gives some extra card draw when needed. It's if we're running out of steam, we can kind of, instead of completely stalling out, we can keep the car idling. And then the last utility land we have here, it's in here, you know what it is. It's Rogue's Passage. And then next I have a couple of dual lands. Honestly, I really just looked at some of the extra ones that I have in my collection at the moment and threw those in here just for budget reasons. I was already, getting pretty up there in the budget. So we only have Battlefield Forge and Rugged Prairie. And then to finish out the deck, our basic lands are 13 plains and 12 mountains. So this totals up to 35 lands. With the curve of this deck being as low as it is, usually I'm more leaning towards 34 lands. In this case, however, we are not running any ramp. As you may have noticed, there is not even a soul ring in this deck. With that in mind, I definitely want to keep hitting our land drops at least up to turn 3, 4-ish. As soon as we curve out to turn 3 or 4, that's usually where our bread and butter is. That's usually where we want to be. And then by the time we get to playing our 4 and 5 drops, that should be pretty close to the end game for us in most cases. If you miss your 4th land drop, but you get it on turn 5, that's not an issue. There is a decent enough amount of card draw to the point where, you can kind of circumvent that as well. So yeah, 35 lands. I mean, that land count has almost never failed me. I mean, this deck, if you're unobstructed, you're looking to have lethal damage on board, ending the game by turn 5 or 6. And even if you need to sandbag a little bit, which is, not a terrible idea, build Anim up just a little bit and then hit the gas really hard after somebody else at the table has been dealt with and had their stuff removed. You gotta kind of play to the table with this deck. This deck is, it's solid. Next time somebody says that aggro really isn't that viable a strategy in Commander, next time somebody says Boros is the weakest color combination in Commander, you go ahead and you send them this video. You show up, you pull up to the table with this deck. It'll change their tune, I promise you. But yeah, no, if you guys like this video, definitely let me know down in the comments below. Let me know some things that you might would change about the deck. Some cards that you think would go really well in the deck. If you want to see more of this content, definitely subscribe my Piper Wright video. If you haven't seen that video, definitely check that out. I'll put a little card up for it. It's really solid. Mono blue clues with like a Voltron theme going on. It's wild. But anyways, with all that being said, I'm getting long-winded here. I hope you guys enjoyed, and Can Iron out.